This podcast was originally live-streamed on the Non Sequitur Show on YouTube. New episodes air weekdays, Monday through Friday, at 8 p.m. Eastern at youtube.com/nonsequitorshow. Make sure you never miss a live stream by visiting www.nonsexshow.com/schedule. For the latest news, polls and updates throughout the day, follow us on Twitter at nonsexshow or facebook.com/nonsexshow. That's NONSEQ show. If you'd like to get exclusive content, bi-weekly private hangouts with Kyle and Steve, backstage access to chat with guests after shows hosted on your channel and much more, become a Patreon saint of Non Sequitur. It ensures we continue to improve our show and brings you into the process at the same time. Visit patreon.com/nonsequitur today while the limited spots are still available.
The following podcast is intended for those who believe bold ideas are righteous, unique perspectives are gospel, and strong opinions are sacred. This is Non Sequitur. Never follow. And now, here are your hosts, Kyle Curtis and Steve McRae.
Welcome, everyone. I hate that you didn't get to hear me do the first intro just perfectly. This was the one time that I just nailed everything.
It was spot on.
Sorry that you're not done. But nonetheless, I have the pleasure of introducing once again,
for the third time,
Stephen DiMattei, an expert in, he's a biblical scholar and just a really, really, really knowledgeable guy. And we're excited. I'm on pins and needles. This has been like 2 weeks in the making to get to hear what these. So, Dr. DiMattei, let's go through it one more time on your end. I'm going to let you introduce yourself again, and
okay.
Also, he did fantastic introducing himself last time. Sorry that you missed it, but we're going to give him the third go round. So, Dr. DiMattei, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, great. So let me just start by saying I have a PhD in early Christianity and New Testament. I have MAs in classical studies and comparative literature and another upper-level degree in Hellenistic Judaism that I got while I was in France for a while. I have several articles published on New Testament authors such as Paul, whom I wrote my doctoral dissertation about, his exegetical method of the Old Testament. So I've always been really interested in interpretive traditions. But during the last 10 years, I would say my interests have shifted from the New Testament to the Old Testament, and I've been studying the Pentateuch, basically the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And largely, I've been interested in what scholars call source criticisms, understanding the different sources or texts that went into the compilation of what we now call the Pentateuch. So basically, one of the things that I've been interested in lately is interjecting this scholarship into the hotly debated public topic of contradictions, because at present, there is really no expert voice sort of in that dialogue. And there's a lot we actually know about the collection of texts, these ancient texts we call the Bible. So me sort of providing you guys information about contradictions might help shape this public dialogue in more specific ways. When
you say contradictions, though, do you break them down like logical contradictions or Scrabble contradictions or apparent contradictions?
I don't. I have visited various atheist websites that sort of glibly list contradictions, and some of which I cringe at. So coming from this from a scholarly perspective, let me just say back up. All of the contradictions in these 66 different books can be explained as a result of different authors or different textual traditions or different oral traditions or different ways scribes told stories, and both variations were later compiled. So all of them can be explained particularly that way. So when I get into a contradiction, I'm more interested in looking at the way 2 different authors thought about a particular theological idea, told a particular story differently, how religion changed from the 9th century Israel until in the early Christian period. I mean, to think that religious authors did not have a changing or adaptable view of sacrifice, of prophecy, of even how one views God is ridiculous. So the Bible actually bears witness to all these different changes. So I prepared a couple here, Stephen. So I more or less categorized some of the contradictions as storytellers. So storytellers told stories differently depending on their geographical location, depending on the time period. And then I would classify some as theological differences. So, some texts of the Hebrew Bible claim that Yahweh does not regret things. He cannot repent. He's not human like that. Well, that's a later theological development. Earlier authors were pretty comfortable presenting Yahweh repenting, getting angry, changing his mind. So the theology sort of adopts and changes, and we have both theologies in the Old Testament. So I'm interested in that. And then changing religious ideas. So we have a lot of laws in the Old Testament that talk about festivals. Well, these festivals' dates and what they were actually got modified throughout the years. So I sort of classify them that way, Steve.
Just a second ago, you were talking about, you made an interesting point in your first introduction. Can you go back and tell people about the website that you started, and up until this point, how many contradictions you have
right.
found so far?
Right. So a few years ago now, I had already worked on compiling a different number of contradictions, so I decided to open up my first blog, as it were. Basically, contradictionsinthebible.com, and what I was doing was every single day posting a contradiction. So the first contradiction was the two different creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, and then the next day I posted another contradiction. Unfortunately, I have lost the habit of doing that. I really need to pick that habit back up, because the plan was to start with Genesis and end with the book of Revelation, and really to go through the whole Bible in chronological order. But where I did stop, we had just entered into the book of Deuteronomy, and I think we already counted 380 contradictions there in the first 4 books of the Bible. And again, most of these, 99% of them, are explained by acknowledging different authors and different textual traditions.
What's the biggest one or the one that you find, like you said earlier, the ones that you cringe at? What's the most cringe-worthy contradiction that you find that apologists use, or you know what I mean?
So for example, I was sent a message the other day on Twitter about Genesis 2, and God. Once they ate from the tree, God declared them, God said that they would die. So atheists often use that as well. That didn't happen in the text immediately. Therefore, it's a contradiction. That's part of the storytelling. I don't necessarily look at that as a contradiction. On the other hand, I could, maybe later we can talk about some of the contradictions that I feel are extraordinary to talk about, actually. What these biblical scribes were doing, quite intelligent individuals, was ingenious, actually.
Can you give us an example of one of those?
Yeah. So currently, as you know, I published a book last year called Genesis 1 and 2, or Genesis 1 and the Creationism Debate. And I'm currently working on a book about the author of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is a fascinating text, actually. So the book of Deuteronomy, if you read it on the surface level, Moses is speaking. And basically what Moses is doing, he's retelling, so he's retelling particular events that happened in the wilderness period. But every time Moses retells these past stories, he tells them with variations and extreme contradictions. So let me just take a small one. At the opening of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses re-narrates the story of the origin of Israel's judiciary. He was visited by 600,000 people, and God put him in charge to charge other people to listen to the cases. And so the story itself is pretty bizarre. What sort of cases would be in the wilderness sort of setting of the story? But anyhow, when you go back to the text of Exodus, there's another story, another scribe, another tradition told the origin of Israel's judiciary in a different way. And that was established by the Midianite Jethro. And he's completely absent in the Deuteronomist retelling. But the most significant thing in Deuteronomy is Moses retells the giving of the laws at Sinai, or Horeb, depending on what tradition we're looking at. And basically, if you look at the book of Exodus, the book of Exodus recounts the giving of what we call the Ten Commandments. And then Exodus chapters 20 through 23 is a whole list of what scholars call case laws. that were given at Sinai, or they're presented. So we're talking about stories, nothing really historical. These are stories. So you establish a tradition and a law code by tacking it on to an ancient sort of event, as you would say. So the giving of the laws at Sinai. So Exodus 20 through 23, the people receive these laws. Now in Deuteronomy, when Moses re-narrates this event, he says, Yahweh only gave the people the 10 commandments. And he gave me in my ear the laws that I'm going to give you in Deuteronomy 12 through 26. Now, that's interesting. It's a whole contradiction, because in Exodus, the people hear the laws and accept them. And there's a whole sacrificial ritual accepting them. In Deuteronomy, Moses says that's not happening. So that's at the surface level. What's happening now the biblical scholar comes in and say, well, the text of Deuteronomy was written around the 7th century, and there was religious laws that were being changed at the time. And what the author is actually doing, he's substantiating new laws, Deuteronomy 12 through 26, by presenting them as Moses simply re-narrating a past event. So that's one sort of very elaborate type of contradiction, and maybe I lost you guys a little bit in
Not at all.
No. So who actually came up with when it comes to Deuteronomy? Who wrote the Levitical Code? Where did that actually come from?
Right. So the Levitical Code will keep as the book of Leviticus, which is another total story. But Deuteronomy. So scholars surmise that if you read 2 Kings, I forget what chapter it is, but there is a historical king called Josiah, and during his reign, he is one of the kings that is looked at as quite. He's a positive, good king. One of the things he did was a religious reform. So at that particular time, historically, Israelites could worship Yahweh at different altars throughout northern Israel and southern Judah. They could, I use that word, perhaps maybe I should choose a different word. They were also worshiping different other deities at this time. So we both know that from the biblical record and the archaeological record. Josiah's religious reforms actually centralized the religion in Jerusalem and banished all other altars, as it were. So scholars surmise that this, and that's part of the law code in Deuteronomy 12 through 26. So we surmise that this particular law code was written around the 7th century, or it might have been written earlier. And the story in Kings is that Josiah finds it. And then he's so impressed by it, he does this religious reform. But the thing is, the law code in Exodus 20 through 23, we surmise that that's probably written in northern Israel around 9th or 8th century. That's the earliest law codes. The book of Leviticus are the youngest. Those texts are all sacrificial texts. That's our author to Genesis, who wrote the book of Leviticus. I'll get back into that later. That law code was written around probably the 5th century, 6th or 5th century BCE. And the law code in Deuteronomy, we surmise, written around the 7th century BCE in southern Judah. The ideology is strongly pro-Judah and pro the cult in Judah. And all these texts were later combined into the Sinai narrative, and they all happen, if you read the story from Exodus to Numbers, they all happen at the same time, even though they were written at completely different times and reflect completely different religious views.
So you think the main reason for most contradictions is because being written by so many different authors, each author kind of added something to it, which does explain an awful lot. For example, I've always said that if you want to argue a position from the Bible, you can pick one, find one passage, then somebody can take the opposite position and find a passage that supports their position. And is that kind of because so many people were involved in writing the Bible?
Yeah, so we have, if you estimate, so we have 66 texts, but you take a text like Exodus, where we know there was at least 3 hands into in other words, the text sort of, its Hebrew, linguistic style, thematic, all tell us, so these are all conclusions that scholars get from the text, tell us that 3 different traditions sort of were stitched together. And then the text goes through a long process of editing where editors freely change things. So yes, I mean, ideally we estimate maybe anywhere from 50 to 60 different authors over a time span of 1,000 years in vastly different geological, political situations and religious beliefs and worldviews. So the Bible, I love studying it because it bears witnesses to all those different changes.
How's the when you talk about the editing part of